We were on a tour in 1964. We went to Columbia, South Carolina. Got to the auditorium. Now this is with the Classic Five, David, Eddie, Paul, Melvin, and myself. When we got to the auditorium, there was a rope right down the center of the auditorium.
A rope.
A rope.
Mm-hmm.
Blacks on one side, whites on the other side.
At 82 years old, Otis Williams, the Temptations' last surviving original member, reveals a shocking secret that has remained buried for decades. He hated him. In this emotional confession, Otis finally reveals his true feelings towards David Ruffin. You won't believe what he says. The rise of the Temptations. Let us go back to the 1960s, when songs were changing the earth. Though there were many excellent bands and solists, one group jumped above the others, the Temptations. Among their songs, you have most certainly heard of My Girl and Ain't Too Proud to Beg, but they were just a bunch of young men full of dreams before they were quite well known. Of those young men, Otis Williams was one. Otis was not the lead vocalist, even though he got the group together. He put in great effort to fulfill his ambition of putting together the greatest singing group of all time. He was resolved to reach that goal and understood he had to choose the correct individuals to support him. When they first started, the Elgins, Otis and his buddies had little success with their group, meeting some other gifted vocalists altering everything. Together they created the Temptations. Members like Eddie Kendricks, Paul Williams, Melvin Franklin, and later David Ruffin combined effortlessly. It seemed like magic. People listened in rather large numbers as they sang together. Not always for the better, the dynamics inside the group were changing while their success was rising. The trio signed with the well-known record company Motown. Success after success, they rose to become among the most well-known vocal ensembles worldwide. Everyone was enthralled with their music, dancing, and approach. From the outside, it appeared flawless. The men seemed to be close friends, and they were living their dream, creating music they loved. Still, things were not always as perfect as they seemed behind the scenes. Imagine spending every moment with 4 or 5 other people surrounded them. Though it sounds great, touring, singing, and performing together may also be demanding. Individual personalities abound, and occasionally, not everyone gets along. Working with one specific person presented the toughest obstacle for Otis. This person made life difficult. Their quarrel developed with time. Otis started to feel something unpleasant inside himself, even though he belonged to a group at the height of its prosperity. Frustration, resentment, and finally even hate. Rising tensions would start to affect, both personally and professionally, the battle between these two men. You could be thinking, who was the person Otis had such a hard time with? It was none other than David Ruffin, among the most well-known Temptation members. David helped the Temptations grow even more successful and had a fantastic voice. Still, behind the scenes, things were not always so simple. David had ambition and occasionally yearned for more group control. His need for the limelight generated conflict. Sometimes David's actions interfered with the group's seamless operation. Otis could see what was happening while viewers missed it. The divide separating Otis from David grew over time. Not everything was as perfect as it seemed, even if they kept producing outstanding songs. Though it can often be challenging, success is amazing. The demands accompanying the Temptations' ascent to popularity escalated as well. Otis was in charge of keeping the gang intact, even amid trying circumstances behind the scenes. David and he had to keep appearances for the fans, even though they didn't always get along. Though for now Otis stayed silent, preserving the group's reputation, beneath the surface emotions were developing in ways that would finally demand to be addressed. Those emotions of irritation and rage did not go away quickly, as Otis would subsequently show. He kept on to them for a long time, until one day, many years later, he at last admitted he despised David Ruffin. But for what reason? What had happened between them to make Otis feel this way? And more importantly, what lessons did Otis learn from this experience? The truth would finally come out, and with it, Otis would reflect on the weight of bearing so profoundly animosity for so many years. The pressure of fame. As you start to become well known, life can change fast. Otis Williams and the Temptations knew exactly that. Ranked highest on the music charts, they were touring all around and everyone loved their songs. Still, being famous is not always as fascinating as it first sounds. Under the strain of keep making hits, travel non-stop, and living up to everyone's expectation, life can be challenging. Imagine everyone is always watching you when you are famous. People expect you to always be outstanding. They are entertained, want to see you on TV, and hear fresh songs. For the Temptations, that pressure was non-changing. Every show had to be amazing, every fresh song a hit, and every interview had to present them as the ideal group. It weighed a lot to carry. For Otis, who was generally regarded as the group leader, it was especially challenging. He was the one ensuring everyone stayed committed and aimed toward their objectives, not only a singer. And given personalities as large as those in the Temptations, particularly David Ruffin, this was not a simple chore. The internal pressures increased along with their popularity. Otis found himself trying to keep everyone, especially David, in line as they negotiated their ascent to stardom. The Temptations first seemed to be unbreakable. To the public, they appeared as the ideal team. They were releasing hit after hit. Still, behind the scenes, little cracks started to show. 5 brilliant people working together will inevitably lead to conflict. And Otis and David got into arguments often. With his strong voice and star presence, David Ruffin started to yearn for more control. Loving being in the limelight, he wanted the group to center on him. It was about everything: the group's reputation, their artistic direction, and how things ought to be run, not only about singing. Although David had brilliant ideas, they sometimes ran counter to Otis's vision. The conflict between David and Otis developed along with his aspirations, and soon their differences would turn into something more intimate and difficult to sort out. Otis, on the other hand, leaned more toward team players. Not only but also collectively, he wanted the Temptations to flourish. But David's continual need for more attention generated conflict. They would fight about which songs to sing or who should lead during gigs. Other times, the argument centered on group management. David insisted on more constantly, and Otis had to deal with it. Not always fun was being the leader. Otis had to keep the Temptations under control while juggling the egos and personalities of every member of the group. It was plenty to deal with. Otis seemed cool under duress to the public, but inside he usually felt the tension. For Otis, the weight of leadership grew heavier as the group's division grew more pronounced, and his relationship with David grew even more strained. Otis praised David's talent and drive in many respects. David possessed a certain appeal, and his voice was distinctive. Still, the same willfulness made life challenging. Otis grew resentful of David the more he insisted on control. Leading a group when one member regularly questions your choices can be challenging. Otis sometimes struggled between appreciation and annoyance. He felt David was separating the group, yet on the other hand, he knew David was helping it to soar. It's like having a friend who challenges you non-stop, yet is also quite gifted. For Otis, that felt exactly like it. Otis valued David's talent, but the mounting conflict between them began to eclipse their common success. The interesting thing is, Otis did not despise David always. Actually, he respected him quite honestly at times. David performed brilliantly and carried something unique for the Temptations. But with that genius came difficulties. The strain between Otis and David grew along with the group's success. Complicated, isn't it? While appreciating someone's talent, their behavior at the same time can irritate you. Otis was exactly in that state. Though he understood David was crucial for the group to flourish, he was unable to overlook the mounting conflict. Those irritations developed over time into something darker. Change Otis and David's conflict was like a storm building under the surface, and the emotional pressure grew as the group gained more notoriety. Leading just made things more difficult. Otis had to keep the group intact, even if behind the scenes things were disintegrating. He had to make sure they kept touring, documenting, and playing. But it grew more difficult to keep it all together with every dispute involving David. The pressure on the Temptations' relationship grew along with their increasing renown. Particularly with David, Otis could sense the strain. Little arguments grew more serious, and finally Otis's annoyance was impossible to ignore. Otis most certainly understood in the back of his mind that things couldn't continue like this indefinitely. Still, he persisted, handling obstacles and trying to keep the Temptations under control. He didn't want to own just how much the conflict with David was weighing on him. Deeply down, though, these feelings were boiling and just ready to surface. And one day, at last, would. Otis's sentiments towards David would reach a breaking point as the group's tensions grew, permanently altering their relationship. Conflicts and tensions. The conflict between Otis Williams and David Ruffin started to show as the Temptations' popularity soared. Little arguments turned quickly into something much more, a wedge that would permanently alter the dynamics of the group. Though behind the scenes tensions were boiling under the surface, it's easy to believe that belonging to a world-class group would be all fun and games. Though the fans would not have seen Otis and David's first indicators of conflict, those close to them could feel the mounting strain. Otis was always the glue keeping the group together, making sure everyone stayed concentrated on their performances and songs. David, though, had a different picture. Seeking more control, he was not hesitant about asking for it. One noteworthy event happened on a tour in the middle of the 1960s. The group had been non-stop. The pressure was rising. David, whose voice and presence had become central to the Temptations' success, started missing meetings, arriving late to practices, and even vanished before shows. Otis, who prized professionalism and discipline, found this behavior irritating. David arrived late once more one evening before a major performance, walking in as though nothing was wrong. Already struggling with leadership, Otis confronted him backstage. "We cannot continue in this manner, David," Otis said. "You have to be here on schedule exactly as everyone else," he demanded. David shrugged it off in his usual confident way. "Otis, I am the star here," he said. "They are here to see me." This comment showed the clear difference between David's need for recognition and Otis's focus on unity, a gap that would soon be impossible to ignore. Otis and David's confrontations grew more frequent and forceful over time. David wanted his name front and first, even advocating for the group to be known as David Ruffin and the Temptations. Otis and the other members felt this did not fit. David was clearly talented, but his quest of the limelight was causing problems inside the group. David's irritation boiled over one album recording session. The group had completed recording a track, but David objected to his level of performance. Furious, David said, "I should be singing lead on this." As always, Otis tried to keep the peace. "David," he said, "we all contribute to this. It is not just about one individual." But David left the others to complete without him, hurrying out of the studio. David's search for more control, while Otis battled to keep the group balanced together, became a familiar pattern. These explosive events not only caused a gulf between Otis and David, but also threw off the harmony that defined the Temptations. One noticed the rising strain between Otis and David. Other members of the Temptations, especially Melvin Franklin, frequently found themselves between the two. David and Otis were both strong-willed. "When you have two people like that, you are sure to have conflicts," Melvin said. But this was about actual resentment, not about different ideas. Working closely with the group, Smokey Robinson also saw the division developing. Otis was always the consistent one, trying to keep the group together, he said. David, though, possessed an inexhaustible vitality. He was great because of this, but it also led to problems. The growing animosity between Otis and David worried the Motown family. Many questioned whether the Temptations might withstand the mounting hostility, or if the strain would finally cause them to separate. It became evident as the conflict grew that the Temptations' survival was under jeopardy and tough choices would shortly have to be taken. Looking back, one can easily wonder, was Otis justified in his hate of David? After all, David's voice on some of the group's most popular songs helped them to succeed. For Otis, though, the problem transcended simple differences. Otis's worry about the Temptations' survival drove him not jealousy or personal grudges. David's actions seemed to him as a challenge to all that they had created. The group's future was under danger from the missed rehearsals, mounting ego, and continuous power struggles. Otis's hatred stemmed in many respects from frustration. Though he didn't hate David's skill or contributions, his actions compromised the group's unity, which bothered him the most. To Otis, the group came first. Anyone who dared to compromise that, regardless of talent, was seen as a threat. The growing conflict between Otis and David started influencing not only their relationship, but also the group's music. The creative process grew strained as David sought more control over song selections and leadership positions. Arguments over who should sing lead and how albums should be promoted even permeated recording sessions. Sometimes the pressure drove amazing performances. Songs like Ain't Too Proud to Beg and I Wish It Would Rain captured the group's inner conflicts by their raw intensity. Still, the constant battles made recording challenging. Often delayed were sessions, and Otis felt under pressure to keep things running despite David's increasing erratic nature. With each performance bearing both brilliance and tension, the music itself started to mirror the weight of the conflict bearing down on the group. The turning point occurred during a late 1960s concert, when David, once more late, insisted on entering the stage apart from the rest of the group. To Otis, this was the last straw. He understood that the Temptations would not survive if things carried on this way. David Ruffin was told to leave the group shortly afterwards. Although it was a difficult choice, Otis felt it was one of the group's future demanded. For the Temptations, the leaving signaled the end of a chapter and the beginning of another. Time, age, and reflection. Today, Otis Williams is 82 years old. He has seen it all, the personal and professional challenges, the dizzying heights of celebrity stardom, and the losses with time. One of the last members of the Temptations, he carries memories shaped and altered over years of introspection. Otis is not the young man juggling the demands of celebrity stardom these days. An older Motown statesman is a living legacy, and aging brings a fresh sort of wisdom. From the brilliant Motown lights to the quiet contemplation of age, Otis Williams' journey shows how time shapes our impressions. Otis Williams looks at his road and discovers that his early strong emotions have softened into a more nuanced awareness. The arguments with David Ruffin now seem more like elements of a greater picture than they did years ago, rather than personal attacks. Not only him, but under pressure and with celebrity, everyone suffered. Stressing how experiences shape the past's interpretation in sometimes different ways, Otis has said, "Time is a way of changing how you see things." Otis realizes from looking back that aging causes a significant change in our perspective of old conflicts. Otis has gotten clearer with age, that is, just with time. Once seeming to be enormous, the grudges and resentment now seem less important. Growing older has let him realize that life is too short to hang on to hatred. Otis has discussed pardon for himself as well as for David. "I stayed miffed for a long time," he said, "but the older I get, the more I realize that clinging to that kind of anger just damages you." Otis's trip from bitterness to understanding emphasizes the need of letting go through the prism of time. So did Otis's disdain of David soften with age? Though the answer is yes, things are more complicated than that. Though he no longer carries the same degree of wrath he once did, Otis experienced very real emotions. "I'll not say I didn't feel those things," Otis said. "Do of what I did. Sometimes being in the limelight heightened emotions, but with time the clarity of thought has enabled him to see that most of the irritation resulted from a more general experience." Otis's clarity with age helps him to reinterpret past conflicts from a more complex angle. Otis's increased self-awareness from older age. He has decades to think about his actions and the part he participated in the conflicts with David. This introspection has enabled one to view forgiveness as a means of releasing oneself from past wounds. "Forgiveness is more about release than anything else," he says. "It's about realizing everyone, including yourself, is flawed and learning to live with that fact." When Otis looks back on his life, he sees the conflicts with David as only one element of a more expansive, rich story. These turbulent years shaped the Temptations' path, but they didn't define his whole spectrum of experiences. When asked about David today, Otis says he is both thankful and guilty and wishes that he could have had better communication. He said, "I'll always remember he was part of something special." Otis sees from his past that his experiences have given insightful analysis outside of the realm of music. Otis knows in his introspection stage of his life that his experiences have taught him far more than only about music. On relationships and personal growth, they have presented rather perceptive analysis. Aging has given him the wisdom to appreciate the complexity of the past and guide a more significant and clear future ahead. Who was him? Why then did Otis hide this for so long? Why, when he is 82 years old, did he not freely discuss the conflict between him and David until recently? Otis, in fact, wanted to keep the Temptations' reputation untainted. To their supporters, the group stood for brotherhood, peace, and unity. Otis didn't want to destroy that illusion. He thought their personal problems should remain behind closed doors so the music might speak for itself. Otis's secrecy shows the struggle between group image, personal conflicts, and the need for honesty. Otis has come to see, though, the need of being open about these emotions as he has aged. For decades, he carried that bitterness locked inside. It helped to define his perspective on the group, the planet, and even himself. At last admitting his resentment of David, closure was more important than pointing fingers or rewriting history. Otis said, "I needed to let it go. I wanted to shed the wrath behind me." Otis's disclosure offers personal relief and helps fans understand the Temptations' dynamics and personal growth. The Temptations were considered for decades as an emblem of brotherhood and unity. Otis's admission of his feelings for David slightly alters, but not negatively, the story. Rather, it embraces their legacy by depth. The group's past gets richer and more complicated. The Temptations' success now allows fans to value their ability to negotiate personal conflicts, overcome obstacles, and find a means of continuing forward even in trying circumstances, so transcending mere talent. Does Otis's legacy suffer from this confession? Though it's difficult to say for sure, Otis's candor definitely confirms his position as the Temptations' actual heart. He has been the consistent hand guiding the group across its ups and downs for so long. Many people never reach the degree of self-awareness and development shown by his eagerness to his own shortcomings and to admit his anger towards David. Otis strengthens his legacy rather than lessens it by exposing his inner conflict. He demonstrates how navigating the complex emotions that accompany fame, leadership, and friendship still makes someone even as legendary as him just a person. It reminds us powerfully that behind every legend is a human being navigating the same feelings we all experience. Otis's confession gives his legacy still another layer. It emphasizes the personal side of his path, rendering his story more relevant and significant. Fans will probably find resonance in this closer awareness of his experiences and help to foster a greater respect for Otis and the Temptations. This view of the Temptations' history adds depth to their legacy, highlighting personal challenges and sacrifices. Lesson learned from Otis's confession. Otis Williams' admission of a strong dislike for David Ruffin offers more than just a window into the dynamics of the Temptations. It highlights how long-standing unresolved emotions can affect both personal life and work. Particularly negative emotions have a great impact on our perspective of the world, decision-making, and social interactions. Otis, the backbone of the Temptations, kept the group alive through trials, but his path also shows the weight of carrying unprocessed emotions for decades. Beyond music, his narrative provides rich, relevant life lessons on personal development for artists, fans, and everyone negotiating challenging relationships. Otis's admission reminds us of the terrible toll hate can inflict on a life. For years he felt bitterness towards David, burying those feelings rather than facing them. This seemed at the time the appropriate action, particularly in order to keep the group in peace. At the height of their success, the Temptations were probably more concerned with keeping the group intact than with anything else. Still, those buried feelings stayed with him and silently, but heavily taxed his mental and emotional well-being over time. Otis, who always seemed cool under duress, admits that years of unresolved anger affected his choices behind scenes. If allowed uncontrolled, negative emotions can sour and grow, which makes forward momentum challenging. Otis's narrative reveals that unresolved anger, bitterness, or hatred influences the one clinging to it as well as the person toward which it is aimed. Otis was struggling inside, even if he appeared to be the Temptations' steady power. Though he didn't realize it at the time, this emotional weight quietly shaped his choices, ideas, and relationships. What happened when Otis ultimately faced his long-buried emotions towards David? This weight of hate teaches us the need to control our emotions before they do long-lasting harm. Though we all have difficulties in our relationships, it is important to recognize and work through our emotions instead of discounting them. Otis harbored resentment toward David Ruffin for far more than what would have been expected. Otis let that emotional baggage to fester by carrying it for so many years, compromising his peace of mind and influencing his contacts with others. Otis never had the opportunity to really atone with David before his passing. Otis's confession provides a sort of closure since Ruffin died in 1991. Otis's admission of his emotions gave him a release, even though it might not have been possible for him to straightforwardly mend things with David. This reminds us strongly that we can find peace by identifying and releasing our emotions even when we cannot face someone personally. For Otis, his confession marked a path toward emotional healing following decades of clinging to that tension. For those reading Otis's story, the lesson is obvious. Although it is essential, reconciliation does not always take the shape we would want. Sometimes it's not about sitting down with someone and wringing out the specifics of a conflict. Reconciliation can be an inside process whereby we examine our own emotions, comprehend them, and let go of the bad ones dragging us down. Otis's confession reveals that occasionally closure is more about reaching peace within your own emotions than it is about getting mutual resolution with the other person. Otis has discovered a means to go forward without regret by expressing his sentiments about David. For everyone handling personal conflicts, including younger artists negotiating the demands of celebrity stardom, this course of reconciliation offers a roadmap. Personal conflicts can readily surface in the music business, between managers, bandmates, or even inside oneself. Often intensifying emotions, fame makes managing problems more difficult. Otis's path provides direction for graceful handling of such difficulties. young artists can avoid the dangers of letting bitterness fester by early emotional awareness and internal reconciliation learning. Why is emotional intelligence so vital for young artists negotiating the demands of fame? Otis's story is especially relevant for younger artists negotiating the complexity of the music business today. Personal conflict can find a home in the demands of public criticism, celebrity, and success-oriented pressure. In a setting this competitive, conflicts between bandmates, producers, or even inside oneself are prone to develop. Otis's experience emphasizes how critical early-on treatment of these problems is. Unresolved emotions, he says, can cause havoc in relationships and professions if left to simmer. Early personal conflict management for young artists helps to avoid needless drama later on. Though fame can intensify feelings, long-term success depends on the ability to settle problems before they become uncontrollable. Otis's story reminds young artists that emotional intelligence is just as vital, even if talent and ambition are pretty important. Even if their main goal is to reach professional success, artists must grow in handling their personal conflicts properly. Though fame can bring many benefits, unresolved emotions can loom large over even the most successful careers. Otis's experience emphasizes how equally important it is to be able to negotiate personal problems with maturity than to be able to perform on stage alone. Though taken from the realm of music, this lesson is relevant to anyone working under duress. Here also is a more general life lesson on the passing of time and the viewpoints we acquire as we grow older. Otis's narrative speaks to everyone, not just musicians. Often as we get older, we discover that historical events have fresh significance. In retrospect, what appeared to be an insurmountable challenge at the time could seem small. Though it brings clarity, aging also reminds us that we might not always have the time to mend every damaged relationship. Otis's confession reminds us to take care of our unresolved feelings sooner rather than later. Time still allows us to atone. What attitudes do we gain about conflict resolution as we grow older? Otis's account invites us to consider our own life. Do we have grudges towards someone? Are feelings we have been dragging around for far too long? Although it's easy to ignore these emotions, it's better to deal with them before time passes and our viewpoints change. Even if it's just within ourselves, we can find release by realizing our emotions and looking for reconciliation, much as Otis finally found peace. Although none of us have Otis Williams' platform, each of us has relationships that count. Learning from his experience will help us let go of hate, seek peace where at least possible, and go forward with lighter hearts. Otis's trip reminds us of the need for forgiveness, introspection, and development, since life is too short to carry unresolved emotions. Otis's confession is a powerful reminder of the emotional weight we carry. As he reflects on his past, we're left with valuable lessons about forgiveness and closure. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more stories behind the music legends.